So it's wonderful to be able to share these conversations and share it to others. And the last conversation we did, people really felt like they were inspired. So happy to just like kind of, it's another way of sharing the light.
Yeah, and I think there were some really great questions that came up. I know that we weren't able to address all of them, but there was this one, I guess, notion that had come up about sort of what you mentioned as a spiritual bypass, right?
Yeah. And I think that's been
Do you,
coming up stronger because even there were some questions that were asking about spiritual bypassing, especially within the Kundalini community. But I think overall, any spiritual community is going to have components of spiritual bypassing. And definitely in terms of private conversations I've been having with people this week and people taking screenshots of comments made and then sending it to
mhm.
me. And it's been really interesting what I've noticed with the spiritual bypass comments. Like I haven't really received any like directly, but I've noticed more so on other teachers who happen to be white. Like some of the comments that are replying to them are spiritual bypassing. Like a teacher posting Black Lives Matter and someone commenting, "We're all one."
Right.
So, and definitely, I think it's important that as a broader issue to address spiritual bypassing for a spiritual tradition, but especially within this community. So, someone's asking what spiritual bypassing means, and there's a great book. I think I'm not sure the exact date. Maybe it was 2010 it came out. But there's a book you can buy called Spiritual Bypassing, but the concept is not a new one. It's just simply this idea of avoiding the shadow or avoiding the negativity within spiritual tradition. I can give like a really simple example is on the very first retreat that I led, we did a Kriya to help clear anger. And this one woman was upset. She was like, we shouldn't focus on anger because it's negative. And if we focus
Mm.
on anger, then we attract more anger. And it's like, well, no, if we suppress our anger, then it's going to come out in a bigger form. And that's a really beautiful part of any spiritual tradition is to give you that strength to face the shadow, face the areas of your life that may feel
Mhm.
uncomfortable, and through that to elevate. So the spiritual bypassing can take on a lot of different forms. That's just like one example of it, but it's the avoiding the harsher aspects of the earth or the reality. And what your spiritual bypassing does is it disconnects us from the power of the earth. So talking about the spiritual aspect of it, it disconnects us from the power of the earth because we just want to connect to the heavens. But without that connection to the earth, we can't be grounded. We can't be fully within our power. And as I had a great conversation with Undine from South Africa yesterday, like we can't also tap into the power of our ancestors.
Exactly.
And especially in the conversation of racism, is Undine works with a lot of people. She goes into areas that have dealt with racial conflict within the spiritual community. And the big thing is like for people sometimes feeling guilt over their ancestors, like if their ancestors were Nazis or white supremacists, and then cutting themselves off completely from the ancestry is also cutting themselves off from their life force energy. So part of the
Right.
healing spiritual bypassing is spiritual acknowledgement, like acknowledge where you came from, acknowledge what is, and then from that space elevate.
Yeah, and I think part of it is also you can't just you can't just adopt what's convenient, right?
Yeah,
Like you can't just love me for one quarter of me, right? You have to, this is how I come, right? The total package. And I think part of the acceptance and understanding of this is we cannot just post on social media when it's convenient. We can't just commit to something when it works out for us. And I mean, in a very practical manner, we do what we can. But if we're really committed to a spiritual path and certainly teaching others and holding that presence and space for others,
yeah,
the acknowledgement is key because otherwise what you're doing is essentially dismissing, right, the pain people are feeling or whatever it is that they're going through to then come forward and help them heal through that process, right? So the fire, right? Like I remember when I started on this journey consciously, I'm a fiery person, right? Fire is like, that's what's prevalent a lot in me. And I remember trying to tone it down, right? Because I was like, oh, I got to embrace the other part of it. Or like, maybe I can like ignore it almost, right? Or just like tell it to calm down. And it's like, no, you go through the fire, right? Fire can consume you, but it's also powerful for transformation and alchemy. And so the idea is that we need to accept these things as they come up so as not to minimize or dismiss what's happening,
Yeah.
and realize that true healing happens, and truly you can, as a teacher, hold space and hold presence for people when you're acknowledging what they're going through. In the area, for example, of substance use disorder, right? And when people are like, well, I should just, be able to let go of this, or cold turkey, or we don't talk about just the substance. We talk about the underlying reasons, or what are the triggers? How do you actually deal with them? Because unless you do, there's going to be something else you may substitute it with. And so I think that the acknowledgement and understanding, and also we were put in this path for a reason. We're put on earth for a reason, right? And so if you truly believe that as part of your spiritual practice, you can't ignore the earth. You can't ignore just a part of that as you're running either away from it or to something else. And so I think there's a very humble kind of point of being present and in the moment of just accepting and acknowledging what is happening.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that's, I think, part of the dynamic for any spiritual tradition is there'll be people, many people that go to a spiritual tradition to help them to work through pain, or to
Mm-hmm.
work through unresolved wounds, um, or any type of developmental needs that haven't been addressed. And part of that dynamic is people will put the spirituality on this kind of pedestal, which is very
Yes.
dangerous, that the spiritual tradition is to solve all your problems. And so in that kind of in that kind of idea is then that the spiritual tradition does not hold any space for acknowledging, and especially in this context, structural racism, uh, and then all the different dynamics that that brings up within
And mistakes
cells and
people make
society.
as individuals, right?
Yeah,
So exactly what you're saying, I think of the spiritual ego, right? And it
yeah,
also feeds that because, oh, I meditate, so I must be somehow an enlightened being. And so if others were like this, they would look past the
yeah,
structural racism. And again, I think part of what's dangerous about that spiritual ego is, A, you're certainly, this is not, this is not humbling, but you're also kind of perpetuating this idea of like, we can always beat the odds, that the acceptance of the system is just how it is,
yeah,
but we can beat the odds if we tap into our own sort of empowerment. And where I think what's tricky, and certainly I kind of caveat my teaching with this, is that, as a yoga teacher and as a yogi, I certainly understand the empowerment, right? And I absolutely empower my students, my colleagues, and participants to really tap into that. However, there is a structural component of what's happening in the world, and it's not new. It's been there, and so unless we start acknowledging it, we cannot dismantle it. And
yeah,
so I always talk about this. I think I mentioned this last time, right? We tend to focus so much on hyping up the beat the odds situation. But let's actually hype up the change the odds so that everybody has that time and space to go about their own journeys. I speak about vulnerability, right? This idea that we have to be humble enough to understand what we don't understand, and that we will make mistakes, and that we are fallible, and it's okay. But to caution, communities of color and really most marginalized groups, they don't have the luxury of being vulnerable, because then they'll be seen as weak or can't handle something, right? And so I very much acknowledge and call out sort of whatever majority of the group it is. It's important for them to be vulnerable so they can actually show that. And that's when true being an ally helps, right? Because you hold a space for that.
yeah. I think that that's definitely key for those that have yoga studios, those who are teaching classes, whatever yogic tradition they're from, is holding space through really acknowledging. And so one of the microaggressions that can come up is like the term like I don't see color, which I've
Mm-hmm.
heard a lot. And now, like I was reading a beautiful quotation from Orman Ivanov. He was a spiritual teacher, I think, from the 1950s, and it was a really beautiful quote about racism. And he talked that all of us are part of the great cosmic light. Like we're all cells within the cosmic light, and we're all one. And that is absolutely true. There's nothing wrong with that statement. We are all one. And race is a construct that was created, like a few hundred years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So But it's understanding the system that's been put in place that continues to uh, exploit people of color and black people and create a disadvantage for people that are black and people of color and queer people, trans people. So without understanding and without acknowledging that structure, just to have this idea that simply diversity alone is a solution, or that just acknowledging that we're all cells of the cosmic, heart is not helpful and actually can be very harmful for really creating an inclusive space in your classroom. And I would say for most teachers, they care about really uplifting everyone in their dignity. And so being really conscious of those types of microaggressions are really integral for any teacher that wants to have impact in this age.
I agree. And I think one of the things, so the spiritual bypass, coming back to that, I sort of see it as the I don't see color, the being colorblind, right? I don't see
Yeah.
that we're all different. We're all ultimately spiritual beings. And although we are ultimately spiritual beings, we're still here and we still very spiritual being. I still have to eat and maintain my body and hydrate, right? Because there's very specific things in my body. And I know that there, certainly in medicine, I see this, that people are like, well, with the power of your mind, you can, do all this stuff. And I get it. And I teach alternative medicine, and I know that you have to respect these schools of philosophy and these alternate modes of healing. But even in respecting that and acknowledging that, you're acknowledging that there's a bodily presence, right? And so just like that, yes, we are all part of humanity, but there's a huge chunk of humanity that is suffering. And so those cells all together, if a large group of them are suffering, it can't be that much light, right?
Yeah.
Like we are not allowing ourselves then to be each cell that actually has a chance to shine its light. And I think that's where the problem comes in. And the thing is that racism hurts everyone, right? It's not just a problem of one person versus another, one community versus another. It is something I have white friends who can call me and they sincerely are hurting right now because they're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to post. I don't know if I should post. I've
Well,
seen posts from
that's a
other
big.
friends.
Yeah,
It's a whole
I
other
told you I was
thing.
kind of joking, but it's like in this last 2 weeks, I've become the race whisperer with like colleagues, students, other people
I
sending
hear
me
you.
social media posts like, "Can you look to see if this is racist?"
Yeah, I've got emails and like, hey, I'm about to send a text like this. Is this okay? So yeah, you become kind of like the what's it, the approval category. And I want to also remind people, I had a friend who asked, is it not okay for people of color to continually hold a space? And I said, yeah, it's not. We're exhausted, right? And in the day um, of somebody's life, it's essentially, holding space for business as usual, for work, for conversations, getting on Zoom calls or whatever, hurting, right? Parenting, figuring out how to be there for their own loved ones, how to process everything that's happening. And different people are feeling different things. I certainly went through an anger phase, right? Like there was, oh, great, welcome people who just realized there's racism, or like it's been here all along, it's not a new thing. So I think that a lot of people, and I know I've talked to lots of friends who are, there are those friends of mine who are like, this is nothing, nothing's changed. This has always been happening. And so we're just kind of going about our business. As Black folks who've been resilient and kind of like, look, we got to move forward.
Yeah,
And there are people who are hurting in terms of like, what do I do? How do I parent? And then they have to put on their face like everything's fine, discussing whatever they have to discuss at work or in that, in that sort of space of holding the space for regular work. And now you're putting onto them that they have to educate you somehow about all these things and filter through. And again, not every person's lived experience speaks for their entire group, however you classify, right? That's a very colonial approach. You
yeah,
prescribe a group, you prescribe a category, and everybody sort of fits in. And I think what I'm hopeful is that, people are really starting to deconstruct and understand intersectionality of how these different identities come together. And that I think is being validated, at least in a little bit more in the mainstream. So I, yeah, it's tough. I mean, I'm also exhausted of like looking at every email, as I'm sure you are, right?
There's a
It's,
lot. I have a backlog.
oh
Anyone
yeah,
reach out to
yeah.
me, I haven't reached back. I'll get back to you. But yeah, it's but what I am like, and hopefully it's not spiritual bypassing, but really I also am hopeful of it because I see the spark. Well, I'm like, well, at least people are showing interest now, and I feel like it's never too late. As long as so like with the like one person had sent me a post, the last one, um, and it was along the line of like we just need to diversify the police force as a solution. And
Mm.
I just responded, and he wanted to know if that was okay. And I responded like, well, it's not about diversity. Like, actually, I think police force in New York is already diverse. That's not the problem. And so the things with spiritual bypassing is that we have to continue to educate ourselves. And this is the really uncomfortable space. The really uncomfortable part is to acknowledge, and this is from my conversation with Undine yesterday, who works with this a lot, is that we have to accept the idea that to break apart the structure of racist society and all the different branches of it will be a lifelong endeavor. It's not just an
Yes.
instantaneous solution like, okay, let me go to this one meditation workshop for dismantling white supremacy. We'll do the meditation and it's all good.
This took
And,
more than hundreds of years to develop, right? We're
yeah.
not going to be able to dismantle it quickly.
As for
And
our
certainly,
ancestors, yeah.
exactly. And I think part of that is really understanding that it's a deep issue, and there is some discomfort with sort of embracing that that lack of closure. And but you just have to embrace it, right? This was not built in a day. It's not going to be taken down in a day. And so I
Yeah.
think that people just have to remember that in order to truly bring about change and reform, we are going to be doing this together, but we do have to educate ourselves as well. Because, again, like one person's experience is not everybody's experience. But how do you, as a yoga teacher, especially in that realm of holding space, acknowledging what's happening, and being present, we'll all make mistakes. And I think we just have to be okay with that. It's
Yeah.
no matter how much you can think through everything, vet everything, and make sure that you're saying the right stuff, it's a process. It's a journey, right?
Yeah.
It's an absolute journey.
Yeah. And I think also it's like to acknowledging with the mistakes. I feel like I've definitely been culpable of spiritual bypassing. And the dynamic of addressing it does not make you a bad person. Does not make you there's no good or bad. It does not make you a bad person spiritually bypass, but the opportunity, rather, looking
Right.
at it, the opportunity for us as teachers is just to continue to educate ourselves, to continue to expand the space, also to have a welcoming environment for everyone that's going to our classes.
Yeah, and I
And
remember, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
yeah, and it's just I think that's essential is for all of us to keep learning as teachers. And I brought it up in the last conversation, but even within the Kundalini community is like with gender and sexuality becoming more in the forefront of teaching and looking at like the older teachings, which were definitely homophobic, not even necessarily transphobic, because they didn't even talk about transgender people,
Mm-mm.
and now putting in the context of making sure you have a welcoming space for those students as well. So if you've learned like, okay, men do this, women do this, you have someone in
Mm-hmm.
your class who's intersexual, they're both genders, or they're asexual, agender, then you are isolating them, even though that's not your intention. Obviously, your heart is still there because you're teaching space, but it's just acknowledging the whole space and using your platform to elevate. So the same thing with really studying and continuing to have these dialogues and conversations regarding racial dynamics beyond the idea
Yeah,
that we're all equal, which is
well,
true.
because
Yeah.
but because it's existed in that dichotomy, right? Like that's why cultural context matters so much, is that, at the times you can't, it's tricky because you kind of want the sanctity. I've heard people say this a lot. Like, I want that purity of the teachings remaining pure. I'm like, look, we evolved, right? Like, we no longer just operate in a space of male and female. We no longer operate in a space of just X, Y, or Z. Like, there's, again, intersectionality of identities coming through. How can
Yeah.
I truly be a humble teacher of a tradition and hold a presence that allows individuals to be empowered in who they are? That's the whole point of going, at least in my view, of, when you're holding that space of yoga teaching, help it's to serve people to truly be comfortable and secure within their existence, right? And so I I think that there is we do need to be prudent in understanding how we kind of evolve with the times. And
Yeah.
we're no longer cave people, right? We're no longer tribal in that same sense. And, in anthropology and in sociology, like I've heard and read a lot, and I think their scholars are right on, certainly we're tribal people, right?
Yeah.
Humans need connection. We need each other. We see that playing out right now with the pandemic and social distancing and isolation. But we also can evolve through some of these difficult conversations to allow for the fluidity to exist. So it's not just categories, right? That's
Yeah.
what colonialism has conditioned us to understand. But we can deconstruct that and really understand how to kind of not like fit the mold, but we really can understand how to be fluid with the application of it, so to speak. I think it's really important for us to understand that we're not here to like help or fix people. We're here to serve people. Helping and fixing, right? There's a great author who kind of said that's the work of the ego, right? We assume things are broken or they're weak, but serving is the work of the spirit, and that we need to remember. And the same way I feel that we tap into, when we do in the beginning, the meditation, like I'm not a woman, I'm not a man, right? Like you're supposed to transcend that and hold that space coming from that spiritual lineage.
It's just
How
transcending
could
identity.
we, right, but how could we then, like maybe perhaps we can think about understanding how that lineage can also address what's happening, right? So one of the most powerful things that I heard recently was somebody said to me, a friend of mine, said, I'm ashamed that it took all of this for me to realize that this has been here all along. I'm just ashamed it took me so long. There was a sense of validation there that I think in the world right now, as we're seeing posts everywhere, there are sometimes questions of like, are you doing this because you stand in solidarity for real? Or are you doing this to be disingenuous? Or like, where is all this coming from, right? Is it
Yeah.
just to sound heroic, to feel like you're doing something about it? Is it for your ego? And I think that when that person said that, it just kind of set the stage so differently that, yeah, like it was like a recognition that this has been here all along. I didn't just suddenly wake up to it. The world didn't just suddenly, start becoming, it's here and embedded. And so perhaps we can all tap into that as a community as well, to recognize that and to name it and say it out loud.
And for those,
And that's,
yeah,
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 go ahead.
for teachers, especially for us personally in our own practice to keep confronting ourselves and then holding that space to really encourage the people that come to us to also hold that space of confronting their shadow, to not let it just kind of take over in the unconscious or subconscious.
Yeah,
And
that's why we have to do our own work, right? I
yeah,
can't I can't hold space unless I understand where I'm coming from.
yeah. And then I saw some comments with Henry with regards to gender, kind of different
Mm.
topic, but definitely I know KRI has a new addendum to their teacher training manual. I think they are going through radical changes, and they're making a new manual to really address it. So it's actually a whole space for everybody. Um, and let's see. And then with Annie, yeah, it's just simply about I can incorporate. I want to incorporate to honor racial differences and even gender. It's really just about continuing education. Like there's so many resources out there. There's so many dialogues going on and conversations. And Annie, you were in the training I was teaching, and so you could always just reach out to me, and happy to be a resource about that. Um, so
And I think even language around like if you identify as, this or whatever the closest is that you identify, right? Like even using language like that versus if you're a male, do this, if you're a woman, do that. If you're a man, do this, woman, because you're then perpetuating just the duality. But, when in reality, if people do associate or identify as anything different, they can have the space to have that comfort, right? To have
yeah.
that choice.
Yeah. So now the second question, which we've talked about a little bit, but also like the social media, is so like to be a social media ally. So to show support for this, and it's also understanding too. Like I've seen some posts about canceling people who haven't posted anything about it, who haven't acknowledged it, and it's understanding too, like everyone has their own process with it. Definitely if you can show support in social media, it can really help reach others and really support this inclusive energy that we want to be proponents for and to acknowledge. So that's the opportunity with social media. And it's, I don't like speaking about politics on social media. Sometimes I may speak about it in class, but for me, it's been this process of also seeing like, okay, social media is just another tool of sharing light and helping to lift and elevate. So it's understanding that as a platform, and this is definitely what's here now, what's present, and what will continue to hopefully be present is how do we dismantle the structural racism. And so bringing awareness through social media is one tool that you can utilize.
Yeah, and I think also recognizing that there's breadth of conversation and not always depth of conversation with social media, right? And so I think that some
Yeah.
people are definitely like, what do I post? If I do this, it can be taken the wrong way. Anything can be interpreted or misinterpreted. But with social media, you kind of have to be okay with knowing that to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So I sometimes kind of like just take a pause because there are folks who are feeling like, is this disingenuous or is this for real? And perhaps, just kind of doing the work of like, am I saying this to satisfy my ego or am I saying this sincerely? I think it's, again, just taking a pause
Yeah.
to understand that.
And also being open to receiving critique and criticism, and to let yourself like just be humble in that space. So I always try to be in that space, even if I disagree with something right away that I see. Then I
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, let me breathe, let me really reflect on myself and see if where this is coming from. And there was recently like a post someone forwarded me of an astrologer who did an astrological breakdown of Breonna Taylor's chart. And it was just like, it was kind of glorifying her life and her journey and also her death. And like, I think there was a story saying like her soul came here to help shift the planet. And it's understanding like on a really macro cosmic view, that is absolutely true. Like her soul came in with this mission, but at the same time, it's understanding that she was a victim. She wasn't she wasn't a celebrity, and so that's what like I think my friend was commenting on it. And I saw a few other people commenting. By the time I got to it, people were already fully commenting, and she already shifted it. But but yeah, the people were commenting that it's not really. It's putting up like even though the intention was there, really heart centered. It's
Yeah.
like using a black person as a prop for their astrological chart, and and saying about their soul's journey here to shift the consciousness. It's just like on a person, like you didn't necessarily know her personally, so think about
And
how
I'll,
family would respond to something like that.
right, like if somebody did that for my child, I shouldn't say this on Instagram Live, but I'd be pretty miffed, right? Like
Yeah,
I'd be like, what are you doing? And I think
yeah,
from what I understand is, there's also an ethical element of like, in medicine, like I could have clinical information about people. I don't share it,
yeah,
just because I think like whatever. But so I think that there is an element of ethics of like getting permission to do a chart as well.
yeah,
And though I can understand, again, coming back to intention versus impact, though I can understand that the intent perhaps may be to maybe move to a process of healing from this. Again, it completely spiritually bypassed, right? Like it completely bypassed the reality and acknowledgement of what happened. And I think that that's what troubled me a little bit about it was, when we had this conversation that, so ethically, certainly, but then also understanding where, let's not kind of make it heroic and glorify what actually occurred and just acknowledge the hurt and the pain. Because if a parent were to watch that, or if somebody, it's a bit much. And it's, just again, really taking a step back and just understanding, hey, what do I mean by this?
yeah,
And I think somebody had commented that you can start conversations in social media. Somebody said that they've heard it, like, what was your intention behind that communication? And social media could be a platform to get that conversation started, where
yeah,
you see posts or something and you say, huh, that was interesting. Tell me more. Can we have a conversation offline about this?
yeah.
And I think it is a tool for that.
Yeah, and use your DMs. Like I told you last time where I got the comment like, why is it taking you so long to speak about racism? I commented and then I DM'd and like so direct message for those who don't know DMS.
Yeah.
And so and then we had a really great conversation. So that's something you can utilize, is not use the comment section to have these really deep conversations, but just address.
Yes.
And to the credit of this astrologer, she replied to every single person and she shifted her post. She realized, okay, yeah, how it's coming across is not how my intention. So they did not line up. And so she shifted the post, and I think she took off the Instagram story. So that's the opportunity, is like to let ourselves be vulnerable, to be able to make mistakes, and it's okay. And because all of us in the spiritual tradition, all gurus on here on this earth are still human, and they will make mistakes. And that's part of shifting into this Aquarian consciousness, is understanding that the pedestal, we have to really let it go now. We have to let go of this idea of idolizing people, idolizing tradition,
Yes.
and really feel it within our heart space and really grounded space, and know that everyone makes mistakes. Everyone is with error. But we can rise up in spiritual consciousness by accepting our weaknesses, accepting our errors, and deciding to still elevate, to grow, to learn from it.
Yeah, and I do want to also point out, I think there's also a question about cultural appropriation, but there's a lot going on right now in terms of really people taking a look at their own like soul.
Yeah.
I remember my dad telling me when I first got started with Kundalini Yoga that, do this for you and understand what the teachings are. Because all of these organizations, everything is run by humans, and humans are fallible, right?
Yeah.
The ego will get in the way. There will always be things. And it's a really good reminder, right? Because we should not be idolizing and putting on pedestal all of these things that really are tools for us to look within and really understand how we can elevate our own beings.
Yeah.
And this is just one step of the journey. And we do need to understand how these conversations can morph all of this, right? This is about transformation. And I think the only way to get any reform or transformation, even to have this conversation in a meaningful manner, is to look within, right? Figure out what is it that irks me or triggers me, and be able to talk about it. Because, Amanbir, like you said, like if we're not having those conversations and taking the opportunity for those conversations, we cannot, in all fairness and honesty and humility, hold that space for our students, hold that space for each other. We can't honestly do that unless we're honest with ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's 2:30, 2:32.
2:30. Oh, we're on time this time. Yeah, so as I mentioned in the text of this is just a beginning conversation still. Even though it's our second conversation on Instagram Live, this is a beginning conversation. And really the impetus for all of us is to keep going with these uncomfortable conversations, with this uncomfortable learning process. And I'm learning a lot. Like I didn't know that the whole police force system was created regarding slavery and keeping slaves. And seeing that is just like, okay, the core of it's that, wow, it really does need to be restructured. So, and then a lot of it's also unconditioning ourselves from Hollywood ideas, tops of race, and also the narrative of it. Like I think Gone with the Wind was just removed from some streaming platform, but they're going to put it back, but they'll put it back with a real sensitive warning, talking about how this movie is racist and holds racist ideas, but to not just like wash it away, like it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and this actually comes up. So I'll give you an example in medicine. A friend and I are writing a paper about this, about basically, so when we present cases in school and in teaching, we say AB is an African American male of da 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 da. And I remember questioning, I said, why do you have African American in there? Right? Because it has nothing to do with the actual case. Yeah. But what's interesting is the conversations, or a Latina woman who da 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 da. And, I'm like, well, if she's Latina, she may have to. And I'm like, why are you assuming that? Why is the narrative that you know about these certain people is only X, Y, and Z? And, so one of the things we were talking about is, do you take it out so that you don't add that element to it? Or do you address that, understand as you're looking at this case? I ask my students, like, what assumptions are coming up? What are you assuming about this patient that you need to look at in terms of understanding your own implicit biases? And like you said, it's deconditioning the narratives that we've been told. And I
Yeah.
think that's the key, is understanding that to dismantle structural racism, we need to understand the system and understand its flaws. So I do think that the idea is not just to remove, and perhaps create better content as we move along, but it is to acknowledge the history and the deep roots, because unless we understand that, we won't be able to move forward. I
Yeah.
think that's going to be key.
Yeah. So keep up, everybody, and so glad you could join us. I'll save this. Last time it took me a little while to save, so it took like 2 hours, but I think I can get it within an hour to post it up. And yeah, we will. Yeah, we're definitely continuing these conversations, and more to come with the both of us.
Yeah, thank you so much for creating and holding this space, Amanveer. You're amazing.
Thank you. You're amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone. Ciao.
Bye.